How's it going, guys? So I just got home from having watched the two simultaneously released anime movies, Boku ga愛したすべての君へand Kimiを愛したひとりの僕へ. And to be perfectly honest, I wasn't planning on making a video about either of these movies, mainly because I don't really talk much about anime movies on this channel until they've at least been released internationally, and I have a little more to work with than just what I initially saw in theaters. And in general, my channel isn't really about making review videos or reaction videos or anything of that sort of nature, but for these two movies, I honestly just had such a big, overwhelming sense of something that I felt like I had to get my thoughts out there, and because I don't have a lot of in-person friends that I talk about anime with, this was the best way to do it. Apologies if this ends up being a really messy video. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to be calling these two movies Boku and Kimi because it's shorter and easier for me to remember than the entire titles for both. And roughly translated, Boku is something like to every you that I've loved before, and Kimi is to me, the one who loved only you. These two movies were initially announced back in, I want to say, spring of 2022, touting these two movies as sort of these two parallel films that would change the way that you view the other one depending on the order that you watched them in. This seemed like a really cool idea to me. I mean, I knew nothing about these two movies or the novels that they were based on. The original author was saying something like the ending of the two movies would completely change depending on which one you saw first. I wasn't really sure how that was going to work. To very condensedly sort of describe what these two movies are about, they are set in a world or a universe where you can essentially jump between different timelines. It's not a particularly common thing in this world, and it's not exactly spontaneous either. It can only be achieved by specific intentional means. Because you could, I guess, have characters jumping from one movie to the other, you could, in theory, have something where the stories are going to affect each other. Because I knew nothing about the stories yet, I just had no preconceived notions about how they would go about this, or really how one movie could affect the ending of the other movie in such a way that you couldn't necessarily go back and just imagine yourself having watched the other one. And let me tell you, they were right. Like I said, going into the movies, I wasn't expecting anything to be so profound that I would think the movie watching experience will never be the same because I saw one before the other. When I think about how I saw these two movies, it really did end up playing out that way, because now that I've seen them in the order that I did, I really don't think the experience would have been even remotely the same had I seen them the other way around. So before I get too ahead of myself just talking about my experiences watching it without having explained the movies yet, let's just get into roughly what these movies are actually about. In both movies, we're actually following the same character, despite what the synopsis online may make you think based on the fact that his name is slightly different. We are following Koyomi, who at 7 years old had to decide which parent to go and live with when they were divorcing. You can already kind of see right away how this multiverse, parallel universe kind of thing is going to affect things, because as you would imagine, in one movie he goes with one parent and in the other he goes with the other. So just to talk about the movies in the order that I saw them, because this is the only experience that I have, let's start off with Boku, which follows Koyomi after he has chosen to go with his mother. So right from the get-go, we have this 7-year-old Koyomi who goes into a new lifestyle where he's at his grandparents' house with his mother. A series of smaller events leads him to experiencing his first timeline jump. The way that jumping sort of works is that the same people exist in these two planes of existence, and they're just essentially swapping consciousnesses. And this early event introduces Koyomi to the reality of timeline plane jumping. He becomes aware of repercussions of being in a different plane and how things can change from one to the other. Oddly enough, based off of the premise of both of these films, this is actually kind of minor in Boku. Aside from just sort of introducing Koyomi to the idea of time plane jumping, it doesn't really play that much of a part in his life, at least from what we see up until a certain point. And the way it sort of makes its way back into the story is with the main heroine of Boku, which is Kazune. In this particular timeline, Koyomi has shown that he doesn't really have any friends. He's kind of a recluse and just doesn't really talk to people all that much. So when he gets into high school, this all changes when Kazune comes up to him and immediately starts talking to him as if they've already known each other for some number of years. I'm gonna try and avoid spoilers, so I won't get too into detail, but essentially Kazune tells him that she thinks that she has jumped unintentionally from one time plane to the other. In the other timeline where she comes from, she and Koyomi are dating each other. The rest of the movie essentially just continues on like your basic love story. There's not a lot to do with the timeline jumping or anything of that nature. For the most part, there isn't really that strong of a connection with it. While there are parts of the film that briefly show the importance of the timeline jumping and these sort of, I guess, diffusion rates of knowing who's who and which version of themselves they are, the actual timeline jumping in Bokuai isn't all that important until a very particular part quite late in the film. And this part of the film is when Kazune wakes up to find a letter written by an alternate version of herself that essentially explains the main plot of the other movie. Now, if I'm gonna be perfectly honest, watching Bokuai first was actually incredibly confusing. I liked it on a base level, but because there was a lot of science fiction jargon, there were all sorts of these different things that just didn't make a lot of sense to me while the movie was going, because for the most part, this film was just your standard kind of romance thing with a bit of sci-fi elements thrown in. When it got to this scene where Kazune's alternate self was reading the letter to her Bokuai self, it was kind of strange to me because I couldn't really piece together what any of it had to do with anything that had happened. But going into the movies with the knowledge that the other movie had some sort of relation to this one, I knew that there was obviously some relation that all of these events had to each other. It kind of made me step back out of the movie a little bit, especially because I could see one of the people a few seats away from me just bawling her eyes out. And I knew it had something to do with the other movie, but I couldn't really imagine how this other thing that I had no idea about yet could make someone feel so emotionally vulnerable. Am I going to feel the way she's feeling when I go and see the other movie? Spoiler alert, no. I had an entirely different feeling watching the other movie. The movie sort of finishes with one final scene where Koyomi, as a very old man, gets a message on his little wristwatch that tells him he has a meeting for this specific date and time. He has no recollection of ever actually setting this alarm for himself in his calendar. All it says is basically just to go and pick someone up from this intersection. So he goes there, he has this interaction with this girl that we have come to conclude is from the other film, but don't really know what her relation in all of this is. This scene is very confusing. He has this weird sort of goodbye with a character we know nothing about, and then just kind of sits there and wonders what that was all about. And then, considering he is a very sickly old man, he has a sort of heart palpitation, drops his medicine, and then is helped by this other character, this character that we've never seen anywhere. She picks up his medicine, helps him take it, and they just sit there and chat for a little bit about how they're both happy with the ways that their lives have played out. And then he goes home and tells Kazune that nothing of particular interest happened based on what his watch notification was, but he got to meet someone who said she was very happy with her life. To meet someone who said that she had been happy makes him feel happy, and then the movie just kind of ends. If a stranger can feel happy, then anyone can feel happy. And that's sort of the takeaway at the end of that film. We had gotten glimpses of the other movie, and they very quickly explained full synopsis of what had happened in the other movie that made it affect this one. But realistically, we hadn't really gotten a sense of what anything was at this point. I couldn't help thinking to myself that this movie on its own was actually all that good. Aesthetically, very beautiful. Also, I really liked the music. Suffice to say, I came out of the movie feeling very confused. I thought that the parts of the movie that were story-based around the plot of Kazune and Koyomi were very well done. I gave myself a day to sort of digest and think, okay, I'm gonna go see the next movie tomorrow, which is today at the time of recording. Basically, I just thought to myself, hopefully this answers some questions. I'm not gonna expect it to be an incredible film or anything. Having seen the other film will fill in the gaps preemptively for me seeing this one, and maybe that's what they meant when they said viewing one before the other will completely change your viewing experience. We get into the next movie, Kimi, where I have just sort of middling hopes for it. There's nothing too much that I'm expecting out of the movie other than to sort of answer my questions for the other movie. As you already heard me say earlier, it's not necessarily that this movie was that much better. I will say that I definitely enjoyed Kimi more than Boku. Once it filled in those gaps, it completely recontextualized the movie. So anyway, let's just get into what Kimi is about. As we saw with the beginning of Boku, we have young Koyomi having to choose one of his parents over the other, and in the world of Kimi, he chooses to go with his father. And in both films, Koyomi's father is a researcher of the multiverse kind of thing and world shifting, and the idea of jumping between planes is a main focus of one of his studies. In both movies, Koyomi sort of progresses to become a researcher at his father's research institute, but for very, very different reasons in both films. We're introduced to Koyomi at the research institute where he meets Shiori, who we now recognize having seen from Boku. Shiori is the strange girl that was at the crosswalk that he had to quote-unquote pick up. We don't really know what this has to do with anything. We did see a brief scene at the beginning of Boku where they switched planes of existence, and he did for about 2 seconds see Shiori, but we have no idea who she is. So we're introduced to Shiori as this young, sort of curious girl whose mother also works at the same research institute as Koyomi's father. They sort of get close to each other, and you can see that this is slowly evolving into this kind of a love story where it's going between childhood friends growing up together versus the other one where Kazune just kind of randomly inserts herself into his life. So anyway, we're following Shiori and Koyomi as they're growing up together, and then one day a very specific incident happens involving them trying to run away together. When I was sitting in the theater watching this, seeing these things get set in motion due to this traumatic event that occurs, it made me realize, oh, this was the whole setup to what they were showing us in Boku when Kazune was reading the letter from her alternate self. We don't have enough of the pieces to put together why the events of Boku happened the way that they did. We just know that now there is a connection where Kazune gets a letter that explains what happens in the other world, but we still haven't seen necessarily how that relates to anything. We have another piece, but it's not enough to really fill in the gaps that were left by what the ending actually meant in Boku. Following this very traumatic event that happens in Kimi, we get to follow Koyomi as this becomes the catalyst for why he wants to become a researcher, because he feels that he needs to either undo or fix what he believes was a mistake made on his part. So now we get to see the events unfold as Koyomi goes through all of his research training and goes into university and then joins the research institute. And we get to see an actual reason for him to be doing this. It's really hard to explain without spoiling the actual events of these two movies and how they relate to each other, because once I start getting into details of one of them, it's going to affect how you perceive the other one. Where Boku had a story that felt sort of far removed, Kimi is actually the explanation for why Boku feels so far removed from Kimi. When Koyomi figures out the solution to his big problem in Kimi, it's this huge revelation. There's this huge event that sort of triggers the whole other movie. I got to see a fully fleshed out story of its own with hints at another film that didn't really feel related at all. And then I got to see why all of these things were related and why the whole film itself that felt like it had nothing to do with it was completely to do with it, because the whole point was that it wasn't supposed to feel connected. Like the author said, it really recontextualized everything when Koyomi discovers what the solution to his issue is. I just straight up can't get into what it is because that's a spoiler for both movies. When I talked about the ending of Boku, where he has this conversation with this woman that we have had no idea who she was, I knew when this scene happened, this lady is definitely going to be important. I just don't know when she's going to appear or in what capacity and what her role is going to be. The reason she's important in Kimi is a completely different reason than she's important in Boku. And the reason she's important in Boku is because she's not important whatsoever. She's a stranger. She's not important. At least from the perspective of Boku, she's meaningless. She doesn't mean anything. But in Kimi, from our perspective, she doesn't actually appear. We do actually discover who this character is through the context of the events of everything that happened, and the fact that she is an unimportant stranger in Boku is, contrastingly enough, the most hard-hitting part of the entire process of having watched both movies. It's that this lady at the end of the movie that we have never seen before is actually very important because of the fact that she's not important. I've sort of been able to process the films in my head, but at the same time, it hit really hard because from one perspective, you could see how the events of Boku played out from Kimi, and that was the whole idea of it. Like the author said, I have no idea how I would feel had I watched the films the other way around. I'm not really sure how to describe it. It left me feeling like I had just experienced something that I think haven't in other mediums before. Nothing really touted itself as being something that you couldn't just experience the other ending. I felt very cathartic, I suppose, at the end of all of it, where Boku had initially left me feeling like I had no idea what happened. I was just confused by these random sci-fi elements that weren't directly related to the story of Boku. Kimi filled in those gaps because it contextualized the scenes in the film. It's the entirety of why Boku exists. The whole point of Boku is that it can't and won't get into it. So when we get that final scene where he's talking to the stranger, and I think back on it now, I'm kind of at a loss for words. All I could think is, holy crap, the ending of Boku is now amazing. It's not just like this random encounter. When I got the context of who this character is and what her purpose is and why her being a stranger is so important to the whole idea of the films, I'm getting emotional just thinking about it because there's so much to process, so much to think about how deeply impactful, I guess, all of this multiversal writing, this time planes, to build up to this one moment at the very end where two strangers meet. And that's it. They go their separate ways without even knowing each other's names. It's such a very beautiful and heartfelt moment in the strangest of ways. Now, while I sit here feeling weirdly emotional by myself in my room, I'm not really sure how to conclude all of this. This is obviously not anything like the types of videos I usually make. I usually talk about the music, and as much as the music was beautiful in both films, it just wasn't what I was concentrating on. The storytelling is just way more than I was expecting. And I'm sure when these movies eventually do come stateside or get international releases, people are gonna have different thoughts. They're probably gonna think, you know, these things were kind of weak and this aspect was this and this and this. That's completely fair. I don't think these were perfect movies. I just thought that the way that they played into each other worked so well and in a way that I never could have possibly anticipated. It's weird because it was definitely touted as being these two films that were made to affect each other, to change the way that you view them, and never know how you would have felt if you had seen them the other way around. And I can't imagine how it would have gone if I had seen Kimi before Boku. All I can think is how much it feels like it impacted me. It didn't make me come out with any lifelong lessons or morals or things that I necessarily want to take away from having watched the films. It just made me feel. They don't necessarily make me feel a particular way, or when I say that they're impactful, it's not that they're powerful and life-changing for me. It's just that it's so heavy-hitting in a way that I can't describe that makes me feel like I've just had a very good experience. Honestly, I didn't think an anime movie, or I suppose pair of movies, was going to make me feel this way, but here we are. These movies only just came out in Japan like 2 days ago, so you're probably not going to be able to see them for a few months, and by then I'm sure this video will be long buried and sort of irrelevant because, I mean, that's just how this works, and I'm not even this kind of a YouTuber, so we'll see. But hey, let me know down in the comments if you've ever had an experience that is as visceral as I'm hoping this came across to me. I mean, if there's anything that you think that I should check out, I mean, let me know down below. And if you enjoyed this weird rambling outpouring of my thoughts and emotions, hey, make sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. And I'm sure I'm probably gonna end up cutting a lot of content from this video just because I did talk for a little over an hour. If you do want to get the more uncut version of videos like this, or the seasonal reviews that I do, or maybe even get access to a lot of the transcriptions that I do for my analytical videos, make sure to go and support me over on Patreon. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.